This episode of New Politics was released on the 22nd of February, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
So, David, we are going through the year quite rapidly. I just checked the date and it's almost the end of February. And as usual, we'll be going through all the big issues. I really think that we need to talk about the effects of Zionist groups in Australia, and we will get onto that soon. We'll also look at the interest rate announcement during the week and the release of some new opinion poll numbers. And David, our commentary is frank and it's fearless. No one tells us what to say, no one tells us what to do, and that's the way that political commentary and journalism should be.
And yet we can disagree and still be friends, and we can disagree with each other and still broadly feel that some people at least have the best interests of the country at large. I was talking to someone the other day who said it shouldn't be whether it's left or right, it should be whether it's right or wrong. And in the end, I thought this isn't worth really engaging with this particular person, but two rights don't make a wrong, sometimes they make a third right. Sometimes the choices aren't moral, they're philosophical or they're ideological rather than that absolutist right or wrong. And that's why I do this, because I want to discuss the ideas. I want to discuss them from the position that I come from, whatever that may be. I've had all kinds of opinions thrown at me as to where I sit on the spectrum. I have plenty of others. Debate is being stifled in some quarters, and I think that it's important that we keep the debate alive.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
There was an incident last week in Sydney's inner west when the Daily Telegraph and the Zionist provocateur and agitator Ophir Birnbaum went to the Cairo Takeaway cafe in Newtown, and that's a cafe of Middle Eastern appearance, and Birnbaum went in there to provoke the workers there to create an anti-Semitic incident so that the News Corporation reporters waiting outside could video record the incident and then publish a front page news article to show how anti-Semitic Australia is and how Jewish people are being targeted in Australia just for being Jewish. And then it would use that to say how little the government is doing to protect the Jewish community, and then use that to keep attacking the Labor government politically, as they've been doing for the past 15 months. Now, the only problem was that if you behave like a provocateur and a dickhead like this in Newtown, well, you'll just be ignored and left alone. You know, no one cares in Newtown if you wear a Star of David cap or any other cap. Everyone's accepted, and as long as you don't behave like an arsehole, you will be okay. And it didn't matter what Birnbaum did to provoke people at the Cairo Takeaway cafe. No one took the bait. And the Daily Telegraph didn't get the story that they wanted. They became the story themselves and exposed the way that the Zionist lobby works with the right-wing media to manipulate public sentiment in Australia. You know, whip up a bit of racist frenzy and Islamophobia and silence all those people who criticise the state of Israel. And I think this incident brings up a wide range of issues. Rupert Murdoch is one of the biggest supporters of Zionism and the state of Israel, and his entire media network of newspapers, Sky News, Fox News in the US, these are all basically a propaganda outlet for the state of Israel. So here we have an unscrupulous and bigoted right-wing media operator who will do anything at all to provoke outrage and Islamophobia. And this is all happening hand in glove with Zionist entities in Australia who are extremists, they're racist, they're provocateurs, they're extreme right-wing, they're undemocratic, and they've just got too much influence within Australian media and politics.
It's quite bizarre My guess is that the tactics are a tacit admission that what is happening in Palestine at the moment is wrong. The establishment of Israel as a country was problematic. I'm not opposed to Israel per se. I am opposed to its current government. I think Israeli expansion is wrong. I think that the 48 or the 67 borders, which were negotiated and where most people came out more or less happy-ish, at least, could be returned to. I think, too, there's this tendency for certain people to include everyone who they disagree with or who disagrees with them in various blocks. And I think, too, that Birnbaum was absolutely idiotic. It doesn't matter what his politics were. It doesn't matter what his point was. It was an idiotic way of going about things. I'm pretty sure that the journalists were thrown into it without really knowing and were told, oh, you're going to get a story out of this, just follow and watch. And he's gone in to provoke the story. And of course, in Newtown, I venture to suggest most of Australia, and I mean the vast majority, he wouldn't have turned heads at all. He would have got the same response nearly everywhere. This type of thing may have led indirectly to the 2 women in Melbourne being assaulted, including a pregnant lady being choked with her own hijab. And I will be fair, a lot of politicians, including the Prime Minister, including several senior ministers, and on the opposition side, James Patterson, who I've been highly critical of in the past, came out and condemned it and seemed to condemn it without qualification. So credit where it's due. But the police have been slow to act, apparently, unlike rather dubious terrorist attacks in which the police jumped in very quickly. But I do think all racial violence, all anti-race opinion, all Islamophobia, all anti-Semitism, and I mean genuine anti-Semitism, all racism should and must be condemned by not only our leaders, but by everybody. It's a terrible situation we find ourselves in some 50 years after White Australia was repealed.
And I think it's important to assess the role of the mainstream media in these cases. And primarily it is to whip up racism and to leverage support for the State of Israel, or at least reduce criticisms of the State of Israel. And if there's supposedly so much anti-Semitism in Australia, well, why do you have to go through this process of manufacturing it? And this incident actually occurred in the Prime Minister's seat of Grayndler, just across the road from the Enmore Theatre, and that's the music venue that Anthony Albanese likes to go to. And Albanese didn't go to the cafe to show a level of solidarity or support or see if the workers at the Cairo Takeaway cafe were okay. And sure, he's a Prime Minister, so maybe he didn't have enough time for that, but he could have made a phone call, but there was not a word about this. And we can imagine that if the roles had been reversed, that if we had some troublemaker Arab activist going to a bakery in the eastern suburbs of Sydney and had a team of reporters, say from Al Jazeera, ready to report on a concocted incident to provoke Islamophobia, well, that person would already be in jail, and the Al Jazeera crew would have been already back on a plane back to Qatar. Albanese and the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns, would have had a few serious national media conferences and probably appointed another anti-Semitism envoy. But because it's an Israeli Zionist activist, well, nothing happens. And it's not just the Murdoch media that's promoting this. The Sydney Morning Herald published an article with screaming headlines about a caravan packed with explosives on the outskirts of Sydney, with a list of synagogues and Jewish targets. And apparently these were all on the verge of being attacked. But David, there was no list. It was all made up. The caravan had explosives that were 40 years old and couldn't be detonated anyway, yet the media ran with the story. And the Sydney Morning Herald did publish a much smaller article later on, just outlining what I've just pointed out, that there was no list and the explosives were close to useless. But this was highly irresponsible journalism in the first place. And by the time the truth comes out, well, it's just far too late. But the point is, where did this story come from and how did it develop? There's no accountability for any of this. The propaganda just keeps coming out, and I think that it's actually creating a more dangerous situation for both the Jewish communities and the Islamic communities in Australia, and it just needs to stop.
Yeah, it doesn't help anyone. When you call something out as, I'll move away from particular, like anti-Antarctican. I hate those Antarcticans coming over here, taking our jobs. And if you call everything anti-Antarctican, suddenly nothing is. And it gives rein to genuine anti-Antarcticans to go to town because the language of it has been diluted, it's been spread through. And suddenly people can justify their appalling opinions by saying, well, they call this anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or homophobic or all of those terrible, terrible things. And not everyone is guilty of it. It's just a small number of people who do it. But they really play into the hands of those that they are trying to suppress. Those don't get suppressed and other innocent people do. It's quite a strange way of going about things. And the more that the anti-Semite brigade jump up, the more it seems that they know they're in the wrong boat, won't back down, and they will double down and make things worse. And this is true of the, oh, you're an Islamophobe, from radical sections of the Islamic community. They won't let me speak because what they're talking is against the Crimes Act and hence is illegal, and it doesn't matter who's saying it or what context it is, it's illegal. And of course, and again, I'm talking about a very tiny minority, and genuine racist and racism, of which there's a lot, don't get me wrong, must be condemned.
And in a lot of these cases, people are being silenced or removed. And we saw that in the recent Lattouf versus ABC case, where it was pretty obvious from all the evidence presented in court that Antoinette Lattouf was removed by Ita Buttrose at the request of the Israel Zionist lobby, just because they didn't like her, because she's Lebanese, and for one social repost about Israel of a report that originally came from Human Rights Watch. And it's not a recent incident. I think this happened about 4 or 5 years ago in 2018 or 19. But the academic Tim Anderson was sacked from the University of Sydney for some of his writings where he stated that Israel is an apartheid state. And, okay, well, if you believe that's not the case, we'll contest that in the field of academia, see if it's right or wrong. Test the concept. But instead of doing that, Tim Anderson was sacked. So Tim Anderson survived a wrongful imprisonment over the Hilton Hotel bombing in 1978, but he couldn't survive the onslaught from a wrongful sacking brought on by the Israel lobby. And this week we had the artist Khaled Subsadi removed from the Venice Biennale by Creative Australia, and that's the old Australia Council, if you didn't know. And this was over the works that he produced back in 2007 that were somehow deemed to be offensive to the Israel lobby in Australia. And there would have been obvious interference from the Minister, Tony Burt, despite what he claims to be otherwise. And Creative Australia is now investigating this incident, not about how Subsadi was removed, but how he was chosen to represent Australia at the Venice Biennale in the first place. And just in case you didn't know, he's also from a Lebanese background. We also had an incident at the National Art Gallery in Canberra where a tapestry that was created by a Pacific Islander artist, which included images of the Palestinian flag, well, these were covered over by the staff of the gallery. And there's no explanation for this. There's no indication about who complained or why they complained. There's absolutely nothing. And I think that all of this is the antithesis of a functioning democracy. You can't just have a situation where an incredibly small group of people, they're the ones that are creating this agitation. And we can't have a situation where in politics or in the media or in the arts and in academia, well, people are just removed just because what they say is disliked by a small group of people and without any explanation. And the influence here is just too strong, and there are no repercussions for any of these actions. Now, it's not as bad as it is in the United States, but I think it's getting there. It's almost like a new version of McCarthyism, and ultimately, this is not going to shut us up. We're not going to keep quiet about this. We know about the genocide in Gaza. We know about the Zionist plan to set up a greater Israel project that takes in Syria and Jordan and Egypt and obliterates Palestine, and all of this is against human rights and international law. But a lot of these actions and activities locally in Australia, they're anti-democratic and they're against the functions of a fair and balanced society. And I don't know how all of this can change, but it's something that does need to change.
It needs a bit of courage by protecting the people who should be protected and standing up to the people who need to be stood up to. I was really upset when I saw that announcement about the Biennale. These things aren't just random choices. There's a very large and long vetting structure, which is to do with the context of the art, which is to do with the nature of the artist, which is to do with what does the art say. And many, many people go very close and miss out. And they miss out for reasons that are probably hard to justify. But in nearly every case, the right person gets through. And if it's not the right person, it's somebody who should have been the right person. And in this case, the work was provocative, but art should be provocative. The work was of high quality, and this type of art should be of high quality. And the work was worthwhile. And this type of thing should be worthwhile art. Apparently, the decision was made on an art piece he did 20 years ago after the Twin Tower bombings. I would have thought that not terribly relevant to today's discussion. He really was critical of the Bush government, and he wasn't the only one. And history has shown he was right. They botched the whole thing. Even if you go to the 9/11 memorial in New York and watch the film, which I have had the fortune to be able to have done, it's tacitly but fairly clearly critical of President George W. Bush. Rightly or wrongly is another whole other debate. But they're not happy with how he reacted. So an Australian artist, 20 years later, being excluded for something for this seems a very odd choice. And Tony Burke was apparently the minister. And given that Tony Burke's constituency of Watson is one of the highest level of Middle Eastern population, and we've got an election in the next few months, and he's got a fairly safe seat, but there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. I think he has to think very carefully about how he handles things. And I'm not threatening him, obviously, I am one vote. But there's a lot of anger out there.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
The Reserve Bank has announced a reduction in interest rates of 0.25%, and this is after the media and the Liberal Party has spent years haranguing the Reserve Bank and the Labor government to bring interest rates down. And now that it's happened, David, they've all gone very quiet. Now, the day after this interest rate reduction announcement was made, there was barely any reporting in the media at all. And whatever reporting that was made was either critical of the government, saying that it wouldn't make any difference, or that mortgage holders are unhappy about it and they wanted a lot more and were very disappointed. And I've just thought, well, if you're so disappointed, give that money back. You know, this must be about the most unwelcome interest rate reduction ever. And pretty soon the media just went back to reporting what Peter Dutton says, even though he disappeared for a few days after this interest rate reduction announcement, or they went over to Angus Taylor or Susan Ley and asked them about it, or when they'd had enough of that, they just started boosting Clive Palmer's new trumpet of Patriots Party. And David, I think we've got just so much information, so much evidence about all of this. We've got reams of information, but this is just more evidence of how abysmal Australia's mainstream media is. You know, tax cuts, whenever they're introduced by a Labor government, it's either never enough or it's a bad economic decision. Interest rates coming down, that's a terrible decision. It's not enough, or it didn't have anything to do with the government anyway. And then they go and get distracted with the bread and circus act of Clive Palmer and his mini-me Donald Trump persona. Now, we do not want the media to just be the cheerleaders of a Labor government or any government for that matter. All we want is a media that's fair, that's balanced and consistent. And they're always cheerleading for the Liberal and the National parties, and that's 7, 9, 10, News Corporation, the ABC. Interest rates have come down. Now, that should be a good news story, but it's being framed as a bad news story. And this just shows that there's a continuing big problem within the media.
They spend a lot of time blaming the government for the rates not going down, even though it was clearly the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank's specious arguments. And yes, they've brought them down, but it's hopefully not too little too late, and certainly 6 months too late. It's insanely wrong how people can think. Now, I know that one of the arguments made is that people who are self-funded retirees, for example, are going to take a bit of a cut in some of their returns, but only in some of their returns. If they've diversified, which most will have because they'd have received good economic advice, or good financial advice, the cash reserves are something they probably shouldn't be relying on. That they're relying on stock market, they're relying on property bonds, they're relying on other ways of investment. Hopefully not Bitcoin, but, or other forms of crypto. And I know some of our listeners are out there are self-funded retirees, but I suspect, and if I'm wrong, that there might be a bit of reshuffling to do, but for a lot of people, you'll be able to not take much of a loss by a bit of reorganisation and reinvestment and etc. So that argument sounds really valid, and again it pushes into that group of people who are wanting to protect the franking credits, when it turned out that the people who the franking credits most affected were large corporations. So again, there might be the large corporations not being able to gouge as much interest out of people because there'll be pressure for banks to cut interest rates. And there's no guarantee that the banks will cut their interest rates. There's no guarantee that credit cards will cut their interest rates or other loaning institutions will cut them. We might need another couple of downward movements, which again should have happened 6 months ago. And in any case, they won't cut them for 6 weeks anyway, arguing, they might go back up again. Whereas when they go up, they move them straight away. And the media should be on top of all of this, but they're not unless it suits their purposes. But their purposes at the moment are trying to install an unelectable, from whatever way you look at it, man as Prime Minister.
And we've been critical of the board of the Reserve Bank, and so have many economists as well. But the point is that the Reserve Bank is meant to be independent of the government of the day. It's meant to be independent of whatever you and I say, David, as well. And I think because of this, all the critics in the media have been confused about who they should really attack. Labor government not bringing down interest rates. But hang on, that's the job of the Reserve Bank. But hang on, they're independent. And, ultimately they didn't know what to do, so they end up attacking both the government and the Reserve Bank in equal measures. And I think it's far too early to know or say what effect something like this interest rate reduction will have on the election in a few months' time. But it's not just the one issue that affects an election result anyway. It's the cumulative effect of all of those different actions of governments in different areas of the country. But you can imagine that this would be of benefit to the government. And despite the reporting that we see in the media, the economy isn't doing too badly. The big issue has always been inflation, and the Reserve Bank wouldn't have lowered interest rates if they thought that it would have a bad effect on inflation. So based on this decision, they probably agree that the economy is doing relatively well. And I think most of this is also managing expectations and matching it up to the experiences in the community. And I think that the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has been quite careful in his language. He's not boasting about his achievements or making it sound like the economy is doing really, really, really well, because it's just not. But he does keep talking about the soft landing for the economy. And I think if he can convince the electorate that this was necessary to make the economy more stable in the future, well, that might end up being enough of a political message.
I mean, when we talk about Labor campaigning, Labor is a terrible campaigning machine. They present everything like a high-level business or a university seminar. which then loses a lot of their core voters who get bored with that type of language. There's all kinds of ways to present complex ideas simply. And also, people will believe that there's a cost of living crisis, even if the figures suggest there's not. People will look at, well, I'm spending more. Now, that may not be true, but you've got to deal with what people perceive in all politics. Peter Dutton might be the best person to ever lead Australia, but the perception is that he's not. That perception is pretty solid, but unless they can change that perception, and everything they try doesn't work, he's nowhere. Anthony Albanese might be the strongest-willed, most capable Labor Prime Minister since Watson in 1904. Greater than Chifley, greater than Whitlam, greater than Curtin, greater than Hawke. But that's not the public perception. The public perception is that he's weak and he's vacillating and he's... We can point to good and worthy achievements of the government, but the perception isn't of those. The perception is of the stuff that is less popular. Now, that's partly a government's loss. You'll never win everyone, and for every victory you have 5 defeats. But they're not very good at fighting the perception of this, and they've got to really sit down and work out what to do. And I think the first thing to do is to start ignoring the mainstream media and realising no matter what you do, they're going to come out against you. So you may as well act as if you're a great government anyway.
And I think for the Liberal Party, well, they've been pushing out a very confused message. The Shadow Treasurer, Angus Taylor, well, he's been saying that interest rates coming down isn't because of the work of government, never is. It's because of the hard work of the Australian people. But if that's the case, well, how can he prosecute the case for a change of government if the government doesn't have a role in the economy? So that's a contradictory message that he's got there. And Peter Dutton just last week suggested that the Reserve Bank should resist all the outward pressure to reduce interest rates. But then after the interest rates did come down, well, he said that it was good news. And he said the same as Angus Taylor, that it wasn't because of the work of the government, it was because of the work of the Australian people. And then he disappeared for a few days, probably because he couldn't find anything racist to say, or he couldn't accuse the Reserve Bank of being too woke or whatever. So he's all over the shop, as is the Liberal Party on a lot of its economic statements. And I think that this is the key factor for the next election, or any election for that matter. Who does the electorate place the most confidence in for economic management? And whoever prosecutes their case the best to the electorate during the election campaign will probably win the election campaign. And comparing Jim Chalmers and Angus Taylor, well, it's a little bit like chalk and cheese. And part of that is because Jim Chalmers is the actual treasurer and Angus Taylor is not, but it's also based on performance. Jim Chalmers is a strong performer. Angus Taylor is quite a hopeless communicator. Here's the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, offering his views on the interest rate cuts.
Well, I think the Liberal Party and their cheerleaders in the media were really disappointed when rates were cut, and we see that reflected in the commentary. A lot of that commentary is a political position dressed up as economic commentary. And so I try not to focus too much on the partisan commentary. I focus on the objective commentary. And any objective observer of the Australian economy under Labor would conclude that inflation's down substantially, wages are up, unemployment is low, the debt is down from what we inherited, and interest rates have started to be cut as well. All 5 of those things are positive developments. We're confident about the future of our economy, but we're not complacent. We know that there are still cost of living pressures. That's why the cost of living relief that we are rolling out, which Peter Dutton opposed, is so important.
And I think this should give the Labor government a sense of how they need to run the next election campaign. And the 2022 federal election campaign was a little bit unorthodox in that Anthony Albanese was struck by COVID and couldn't campaign for a week. And then people like Jim Chalmers and Jason Clare and Tanya Plibersek, amongst others, they stepped up and performed very, very well. And maybe this process is a little bit like music bands, David. You know, not every successful band has got just the one lead singer. Some have got 2 lead singers. Some have got more. So the Labor government should copy that a little bit. You know, definitely copy what they did in the 2022 federal election. Get your best performers out there. Anthony Albanese, as you mentioned, he is a poor communicator. You know, get the good people out there to spruik the economic message.
and get a good message. Like focus on
That's right, work out the message and get the good messengers out there.
focus on the victories, and focus on the victories in a way that everyone can understand and in simple language. If I see another chart coming out, I think I'll scream. Yeah, I've marked this stuff before. Yeah, good, well done, high distinction in a university. But out in the real world, on the outside, it's how to turn people off. It seems to be a problem with all of the progressive parties, the Democrats in America, the Labor Party in England or in Britain. Simple messages cut through. Now, Peter Dutton, I don't think, has any chance of gaining 20 seats. Nobody can show me which 20 seats he's going to win. He might win 2 or 3 seats, or even 5. I don't think he'll win more than that. It's just too much of a gap. Of course, Elon Musk, who has interfered in 14 government elections recently, may change all this. But given all things being equal, I don't think Peter Dutton can win. And I assume his strategy is to hold on for long enough that the next election he can eat away over the next 2 or 3 elections and finally get in. Whether the party's patient enough to wait that long is a whole other story. But certainly we've had people like Arthur Colwell, I think, faced 3 elections against Menzies. John Howard kept coming back, although that was broken, but nonetheless. It's an interesting phenomenon that the press are selling him as this winnable, electable, when looking at it from pure psephology. I can't see how he can do it. He'd have to win some teal seats, and as far as I can tell, he's not going to win any teal seat. He might win a couple of green seats, but there's not 20 of those to win. And yeah, you might get that swing between Liberal and Labor you get in the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, and again, there may be 2 or 3 there, but the most I can see is 8. But if I'm wrong, I'll admit it.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Don't ask me to attend, 'cause I'm not all there. And don't pretend, 'cause I couldn't care. I don't believe illusions, 'cause too much is real. So stop your cheap comment. I know what I feel. And we're so pretty.
There's a batch of polls that have recently come out. There's Newspoll and Essential, but the one that got all the news was the YouGov MRP opinion poll, and that had the headline announcement that Peter Dutton was going to become the next Prime Minister, and the Liberal National Party was best positioned to form a minority government. And David, I actually thought that you need to have an election first before you have a change of government, but
Technicalities.
Yes, but didn't the media absolutely love this? The ABC was announcing that Peter Dutton is going to become the 32nd Prime Minister, and what will a Liberal National Party government mean for the electorate? And I'm sure that a lot of the mainstream media journalists have actually got a large poster of Peter Dutton pasted up on the ceiling in their bedrooms. Not sure if it's the photo of him smiling or not, but it's definitely up there. But when you had a look at these figures in the YouGov poll and drill down a little bit, well, these findings that were reported were highly speculative. And in the YouGov MRP poll, the two-party preferred figures are 49% to Labor and 51% to the Coalition. And even with 3 months to go before the next election, these figures don't mean that much because, as we keep saying, these are only opinion polls, and the only poll that counts is on election day. And we'll probably keep saying that until election day itself. But the big question is, well, why so much emphasis on this one poll? And first of all, it's a battle between the pollsters, and this type of news gets all the headlines and the coverage and is good advertising for YouGov MRP. And it also feeds into the narratives that the mainstream media wants to present against Labor government. So it's pretty much a clever marketing trick by YouGov MRP, and it pretty much worked very, very well. And it still might end up being a case where the opinion poll, as reported by YouGov MRP, turns out to be correct. But I think that's highly unlikely, but essentially what they're doing is trying to disrupt and influence an election outcome and big note themselves, and the mainstream media is very happy to oblige.
Yeah. Which of the independents are going to work with Dutton? Are the Greens? I think when it comes down to it, they won't. I'll call them the Teals. They all left the Liberal Party because of Dutton-esque policies, and I don't think they'll work with him. Bob Katter, it's going to depend a whole lot with Bob as to who's annoyed him more this week. And I'll be fair, he's a bit more substantial than that. But my point is that he's not overly likely to go with Dutton government just because he swings to the right. So, yeah, again, Dutton gains 15 or 16 seats, or the Liberal Party gained 15 or 16 seats. And then you've got negotiations starting to happen. I can't see 3 or 4 or 5 independents wanting to. So, yeah, it is a bit of drama for drama's sake. Again, my and most people's reading is that it's going to be a minority government, but with a Labor leading the coalition of governance, because the Liberal Party is almost at irrelevant numbers. And I just think Australians don't vote in that big a swing except in Queensland on occasion.
These opinion polls are there, so we have to look at them and see what they all mean. But the big point that I've gathered from all of these recent polls, and, you know, it's all of them, not just the YouGov poll, but both leaders are a drag on their respective party vote, and that's both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, and that will only change or flip if either party changes its leader. And the last time this happened so close to an election was in 1983 when Labor got rid of Bill Hayden and installed Bob Hawke, and as they say, the rest is history. But this sort of leadership change is unlikely to happen, and incumbency will also be a factor because polling usually returns to the government of the day, usually but not always.
Yep.
And I think one other factor is that it's also who prepares best for the election period. And like in the past few elections, political parties have made that mistake of thinking that the election just occurs on that election day, but don't actually consider the 2-week pre-polling process as much as they could, or as much as they should, because almost 50% of people vote in that 2-week period before election day. And I think that this overall period should be considered as election period rather than the election day itself.
Yeah.
And the other factor is that preferencing is going to be a really big issue, and you've mentioned this quite a few times in previous episodes, and this is something that's not being picked up by pollsters, and that's because the primary vote for the two parties is decreasing substantially. And in all of these recent opinion polls, the vote for the two main parties is around 57 or 58%. And when you've got 42% of the vote coming from unknown and unpredictable sources in all of these 150 seats across Australia, well, that just really makes things unpredictable. There's the influence of Climate 200 and the community independence. There's the level of primary vote for the Australian Greens. How much will that go up? So I think it's a bit of an unknown situation at the moment, and maybe even the major political parties are unsure about how all of this is going to turn out.
I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty. And no, I'm not. This is not a criticism of those people in any party working this out. We're seeing the change happen from this industrialised or industrial parties coming out of the 19th and 20th century, moving into a post-industrial world with the structures of the parties and even the philosophies of the parties in many ways staying within that industrial model. And change is slow. There's generational change that possibly needs to happen. There's philosophical change that is happening. And again, I don't want to be too harsh on anyone.
Well, we don't like being harsh on anyone at all, David.
No, we don't. But in this case, the idea being that things are changing, and if you're right at the cutting edge of the change, which the parties are, it's hard to see what's happening and how to fix it. And it's confusing and it's devastating and it's going to be costly for a lot of careers, for a lot of people with staunch beliefs, as those beliefs aren't rendered wrong but are rendered irrelevant because the circumstances have changed. It's great for us as analysts, but it's hard to see where everything's going, and we can only do our best.
And I think that despite what we've been saying today about the unpredictability of these polling figures and even how they are going to be reflected at the next election. It's also a question of how the Labor government has got itself into this position where it's behind in the polls. You know, not by much, but it's still behind. And this is one question that we get a lot of. How has Anthony Albanese got himself into this position against one of the most awful opposition leaders in history? And I guess it just goes to show that leadership is all relative. I think that Peter Dutton is a terrible leader. David, you just spent about 5 minutes before outlining how terrible Peter Dutton is as a leader, and he's modelling himself on one of the worst leaders in the world at the moment, Donald Trump. But as I said, leadership is relative, and that's just my opinion. It's your opinion, but the electorate is made up of people that think differently. And I think that Anthony Albanese is probably one of the more underwhelming Labor Prime Ministers of recent times. You alluded to this before, David. And when you compare him with Whitlam, Hawke, Keating, Rudd, maybe Gillard, we're not saying anything controversial. I think it's pretty obvious. And he's definitely done a better job at Prime Minister than I could ever do. But he's paid to be the Prime Minister, and we're just paid, you know, it's a tiny bit. We're paid to commentate on all of this stuff. And Anthony Albanese, he did say that he wanted to lower the level of noise from politics, but maybe he's lowered it just a little bit too much. And the opposition has rushed in to fill that void, and the void gets filled up by the ridiculous things such as trumpet of patriots. So maybe he's tried to make politics a little bit too quiet. But my feeling is that the more people see of Peter Dutton during the campaign, whenever it's held, the less they'll actually like him, despite what the media keeps telling us. And it could end up being like a repeat of the 2019 federal election, where for 2 years the polls were saying that Bill Shorten was going to be the next Prime Minister, only for the electorate to say, no, he's not. We're not going to vote him in as the Prime Minister. So could happen this time around with Peter Dutton. So these polls are telling us something, but they're not definitive. I just think that it's going to be a very difficult election to predict, you know, whenever it's called, and there's just so many different factors to take into account.
John Hewson is the other, because it's a little bit similar to Dutton in that he had very strong media support. He was in the Liberal Party. The government had disappointed in many ways, yet John Hewson is now a well-liked and respected commentator, and Paul Keating is ex-Prime Minister with 2 terms. So again, unless we get Elon Musk interfering or somebody else interfering, I can't see how Peter Dutton can win, even if he is more popular. He's not more popular by the 16 or 17 points he needs to be more popular and to scrape through by 1 seat. I just can't see where the approximately 20 seats are coming from, because they've lost a lot of their heartland and they haven't gained a lot of alternates. So it'd be interesting. We will be watching with deep fascination.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.